Hello, I'm Ian Humphreys and welcome along to UK Medical Freedom Alliance TV. And today we've got a great interview with Magdalene Taylor. She was there with the inception of the Informed Parent, a newsletter which has gone out now to people all over the place, especially in the UK, but for 33 years. And we're kind of hitting the anniversary of when the actual newsletter itself is coming to an end, but Magdalene is going to continue with her work via her website, Substack, etc. This is a fascinating interview. It's all about childhood vaccines. It's all about childhood generally, and it's information that you really need. Links to all of her Substack and her website, etc. are going to be in the description below. But why don't we just get on and talk to Magda. Welcome to another broadcast by the UK Medical Freedom Alliance, the UK's most recognised and respected organisation advocating for every individual's right to informed consent, bodily autonomy and medical choice. We are the UK's voice of ethical medicine. Well, hello Magda, thank you so much for joining the UK Medical Freedom Alliance. We're so grateful for you to give us your time and to come and talk about the Informed Parent and what you've been doing over the last, I was going to say few years, but it seems like it's quite a fair amount of time now.
Yes.
I think without any sort of silly delay, why don't we just dive straight in and find out how this all started? So this goes back, I think, to about 1992. So
yes.
It's quite a fair time away. So what happened then to make you start the Informed Parent?
Well, thank you, Ian, for inviting me on. And yes, what did happen? Well, it was actually September 1991. And I was at that point a mother of two small children, so Ruby was about 2.5 and Nancy was about 1. So maybe around that number. Anyway, just happened. Prior to that, I'd never questioned vaccination. It's not something you generally think about when you're just, a young adult. It's, and when parenthood comes along, then as majority of us would just naturally think, oh, you must have them vaccinated. It's like something you're brought up to believe that it's a good thing and that we've eradicated smallpox, etc. So I didn't question it, but I had what I would say, like my background prior to that. I wasn't one to go to the doctors generally at all, really. And our family, we didn't really use the doctors. We were very much, my grandmother lived with us, so she always kind of questioned things more. And so any other kind of thing, well, we wouldn't have had any medicines in the house, not even anything for a headache, or we never really had headaches. We didn't know what they were. And, we if something like a hot water bottle would have done for soothing us if we had an upset stomach or just needed a bit of comfort, and we used to just rest and that was it. But with vaccination, I just thought, well, this is something different. It wasn't. And so I never questioned it. And being a new mum for the first time in 1988, I just wanted to do everything right, And it's not long after you have your baby that you get these little invites, bring your child in for the first round of vaccines and the baby check. So I just went along. I don't think anyone, personally, I didn't enjoy taking my daughter to have them done because it's, they're often sort of sleeping in your arms and the next minute you're handing them over and they're being jabbed suddenly and it wakes them up with a squeal and, it's unpleasant. But all the time you're thinking, well, it's just a few seconds and it's for something very good. We're going to stop disease. So that's how I was thinking up until September 91, when I just happened one evening to be looking through the London Evening Standard journal that they brought out once a week. I was just flicking through it and I opened a page, Vaccination, the Hidden Facts. And I thought, what's that all about? And it was a 2-page article. And I mean, they certainly wouldn't put it in these days. How it ever got to print, I do not know. And I know there was a lot of upset afterwards from the health department, even coming, unhappy that it had been published. But it was an interesting article, and it talked about, things like the decline in diseases well before vaccination. It was talking about the unnatural entry into the body via a syringe, a needle, and a little bit about mentioning, I think, about the ingredients. It talked about vaccine damage, which I wasn't really even aware that it caused any damage. So it was, and they mentioned a homeopath as well who had written on the subject. This was before the internet. So at the end, they put suggested reading list. And I looked, I thought it said send a stamped addressed envelope. That's how antiquated we were then. So I did, because it struck me with such an alarm, which I'd never had before, just like a sort of alert in my body saying, you must look into this. So I sent off for the list, and there was a number of books. Again, they certainly wouldn't list them these days. And most of them were specialist books, so you had to order them. So I couldn't just go into WH Smith's and buy them. So I thought, well, okay, where do I start? So I literally ploughed my way through all the list. I just sent off for another book and another book, because I'm not the type that would just read one thing and change my mind. I really like to check it out. I'm very skeptical, actually, about things when I read them. So as soon as I started delving into all these big books over the next few months, I just thought, my goodness, so much that we don't know as parents, and we're just led to believe a certain storyline. And my second daughter was due for MMR at that time. And as I read more and more, I thought, no, thank you. I don't want to proceed. Certainly at that point, I mean, I wasn't absolute, like I'd never do another one at that point. And that's how, so over that following year, by the September 92, I'd started to sort of talk to others about it. And most people just said, oh, it's probably fine, But, I did come across then some parents who'd had independent midwives and had their babies at home. And in fact, it was the midwives that actually suggested they should look into it, which is interesting. And then the other mother was a health journalist, and she'd had her daughters later in life. And because she'd done a lot of health research, she chose not to vaccinate. So the other 3 mothers involved had got all unvaccinated babies or children. I was the only one who'd started on the schedule, recommended schedule. So when we got together, we thought, well, what can we do about trying to get more information out? So we thought, okay, let's set something up. Not to say you should or you shouldn't. It's like trying to get people to study, make an informed choice based on a much broader amount of knowledge and information. And that's how we sort of started, just 4 mums. And we literally had one article put in one of the journals of complementary medicine. Leon Chateau was the editor back then. He was a sort of holistic writer and practitioner. And he made our star letter, and we just put what we were trying to do and everything. And we got about 50 people wanting to subscribe to this very, very short newsletter that we started with. And we just started from there. And so, I mean, it sort of grew quite rapidly, because at that time, early 90s, there was suddenly a lot of questions around the MMR. And so there was more sort of public interest. And over those next few years, we grew there was hundreds and hundreds, and by 94, when they were doing a measles rubella campaign, we had about 1,800 subscribers. So it was quite but we didn't really know it was a much bigger thing that we'd taken on board than we realised. And by 94, the other three mums couldn't sort of manage to carry on with it because of all the demands. And so I thought, well, I just had this strong, probably perhaps because I had started on the vaccines, I had more of a reason. I was annoyed and angry that why didn't we have this information before? So I thought, well, it's.
Well, I have to say, I mean, like I say, I'm as you're talking, I think I'm becoming more annoyed in many ways, because my children were born roughly the same time.
No.
One 1990, one 1994.
Yes.
And I knew none of this at all in those days. Nothing. And in our our cohort, no one was talking about this in any way. So obviously, no one in my eye line had ever read the Standard article or it's incredible that it was so, I suppose, suppressed after that. You would have thought actually that should have blown up into something that became public knowledge everywhere. It's really weird.
Well, it's probably like you. I mean, I was very naive, actually, because when I first started to find out all about, declines in disease and well before vaccines, etc., when we got a few kind of journalists approaching us for some of the mainstream, I thought, oh, once they see the graphs and once they see this, once people realise we took the wrong path, it will all change. Well, of course, no, quite the opposite. In fact, a lot of...
It's got worse.
Yeah. So, as you say, you would think it would have blown up then. Instead of that, I just watched over the years, especially since the 2000s started, I mean, more and more suppression of information. These days now it's awful compared, in the early 90s, even BBC, say Radio 4, did quite a few programmes. I was on a few breakfast programmes on TV, morning breakfast programmes. They were actually discussing it rather than suppressing it. They weren't attacking you. Whereas now, if anyone manages to get onto it, invited on these programs, they're there to try and make you look like some sort of, conspiracy theorist, a lunatic type of image. Whereas then it was much better. So it just shows you that actually there's such a strong determination to suppress this information. It's not that they're embracing like, oh, that's interesting, what have you found, and let's look at this. No, quite the opposite. It's like they shut you down. It's a no-go zone. You mustn't discuss this subject. Vaccinations have saved millions of lives. One of the fantastic achievements of modern medicine. How dare you approach this subject? And are you qualified anyway? Because did you go to university? Are you a medical doctor? And all this stuff thrown at you. And
I wonder, actually, because our relationship with the medical profession has changed an awful lot, obviously, since we were kids, and even worse since our kids were kids. I wonder what our doctors would have thought back in the late 50s, early 60s, whether they would have pushed back on a lot of this, because I think they were different people for me.
Very different, yeah. I think they would have done. If the modern doctors now, sadly, are trained in a different way. So they're very much trained. All the pharmaceutical industry has their tentacles everywhere in medical schools and what they're teaching. And when you look back, what's interesting with old medical literature, they were more honest then, and they were more critical, So there were doctors, say, for instance, there's what comes to mind in the British Medical Journal in 1959, there were doctors talking about measles and talking about it like, oh, it's the most commonest disease in children, rarely any complications. They even say, in fact, after a bout of measles, a child's development's often noticeably better, and they go up a peg. It's like a maturation process, and so you've got all these things, and then you even get into the early 60s, where I remember there was one doctor saying, "Oh, do we really need to notify measles anymore?" And because they used to get paid half a crown, two shillings and sixpence every time they notified. But he said, "Is it really necessary? Do we have to go out?" And that's how they were looking at measles. And yet, of course, in the States, they introduced the measles vaccine in 1963. They're always usually a little bit ahead of putting another jab into the schedule. And then, during the 60s, of course, there was an increase in bit of publicity. Oh, measles is more dangerous than we realise type of stuff. And by 1968, they introduced the first single measles vaccine. But even then, the first few years, there wasn't much of an uptake because most people had a realistic view. But then, of course, once they were starting to scare people more and more, it's sort of a marketing tool prior to another vaccine coming out. So, by the time the MMR came out in 1988, they'd been really pushing hard over the previous decade to sort of start saying, well, not only measles is really dangerous, your child could die, type of stuff.
Please consider donating to the UKMFA. We are really grateful for all donations, no matter how small. Your donations enable us to continue to lobby for your right to informed consent and medical freedom to be upheld, and to provide resources to educate and empower the public. There are multiple options for donating. One is that you can scan the QR code that's on this video right now, or you can go to the link that is featured in the description below this video, or you can go onto our website and contribute via donor box, or you can buy us a coffee.
They were starting to say mumps, it can cause this, that and the other, and rubella, which is, it's what's interesting, say mumps, for instance. It wasn't even a notifiable disease until they brought the MMR out. So, they weren't worrying about it beforehand. And there was no justification. They said in the British National Formulary, which is a book for the doctors, all about all the drugs and vaccines, back in the mid-80s, that, measles, mumps is such a benign childhood acute that there's no justification to introduce the vaccine. So, and actually measles, even like, as I said earlier, the decline, I mean, the worst case, obviously no one wants the child to die from things like measles. Well, they don't actually ever, even in the past, they weren't dying of measles, they were dying of secondary complications. And the main reason behind that was because of their living conditions. And so if you look at when they started to collect data back in the end of the 1800s into the 1900s, measles mortality was falling rapidly, and in line with all the improvements in living conditions, sanitation, clean water, all these things, the obvious things. And so by the time the vaccine came out, the death rate from these complications was very, very, very low. Just almost, I think it's over 95% in decline by then. So it wasn't as if there was still, all these deaths and injuries. No, they'd all declined, and not just measles, all those whooping cough, diphtheria, TB, smallpox, all of these things all declined at the same time for the same reasons. Better conditions.
So those people that weren't vaccinated, the mothers that didn't vaccinate their children that you knew, did the children suffer as a result?
No, they thrived. They were healthy. In fact, when I got more into the subject and I met with older people who'd started to question vaccines, back in the 40s and 50s, and, amazing, some very elderly people, and they they all said the same thing, that their children at school who were unvaccinated, the teachers even said, wow, your child's so alert and a very, just a pleasure to teach. I wish all the other children were like that. So, that's what I've heard numerous times. And another good study, which is only tiny, and it would just be anecdotal in terms of the medical world, they'll say. But when people have started to question it and they've gone on to have other children, so let's say they had 4 children, and the first one's vaccinated fully, the second one maybe a little bit less, and then the third and the fourth not at all as they learn more. They all say how healthy their unvaccinated children are compared to the earlier ones they had. And that's a good study because they're all living in similar conditions, same parents, etc., etc. And that's very noticeable. And so, but these kind of things are not looked into. It's just dismissed as coincidence that they happen to be healthier. Or occasionally, they have done some small studies dotted around the world where they have come to the conclusion, looking at unvaccinated compared to vaccinated, that the unvaccinated ones are healthier, less allergies, less of these kind of conditions like autistic spectrum type of stuff, just generally healthier and more alert in every aspect. So, but there's a.
So did you come to a conclusion as to why these studies weren't being undertaken?
Well, like I say, I was naive at the beginning, but what I would say is I realised how protected the vaccine industry is. I don't know about protection for people having the vaccine, but the actual industry is heavily protected, and there's nothing that they don't want any of these kind of studies to be funded because it's not in their interest. It's all about financial interest, really. That's, I think, the main thing, keeping the public ignorant, because if you sort of push the idea all the time on the public that there are these germs out there, or viruses now, we keep hearing every other week there's a new one they found. Well, they haven't found any, actually. All they do is make assumptions in the past when they started this whole idea of virology. But, they're constantly putting people in fear, and the germ theory serves a huge advantage for the vaccine industry, because you can keep saying, well, there's this disease caused by this germ, and unless we get a vaccine, then you are risking your life stepping out of the front door, or maybe it's even lurking in your house. It came through the window. So it's like no, they wouldn't. Who would fund it? And if it's funded independently, well, it's very hard to get. What independent body will fund that? It's trying to get the funds, isn't it? And then it's got to be recognised.
So most of the money is probably with the companies that are producing the vaccines, isn't
exactly. It? Well, the money's all the time. Every aspect of medicine now is the money, and the interest is from the industry, and they're not. Why would they want to say, oh, actually, we just discovered the germ theory is not accurate. It is just a hypothesis. And we're not even sure if now that there are viruses. How would they actually admit that? So it's yes, like I say, I was very naive then, but now I realise that they're protecting a huge industry, and it brings in a lot of revenue. And I think one good thing that came out of the COVID story, because I won't call it anything else but a story, is that it's made more people question vaccines generally, because they sort of started with that. And then because of all the different social media and people posting interesting articles, and then people go thinking, well, hang on, that sounds interesting. So I
I don't think it's just childhood vaccines that people are questioning now either. I think it's probably most medical interventions, isn't it, one way or another?
well, it's good,
And
yeah, because most things. I mean, I've said it so many times. I can't remember if I've said it before on the, in a conversation. But all symptoms that we produce, as far as the medical world's concerned, they're all symptoms that are something the body's going wrong. They never think, oh, is there a reason for that fever? Is that kick starting the process of chucking rubbish out? So when we have rashes, we're throwing stuff to the surface to externalize rubbish. When we're having mucus, we're pushing it out. It's clearing stuff out that the body doesn't want. But with everything now, you've got to stop it. So what do they tell mothers when they take their babies in? Oh, have the vaccine, and if they have a bit of a fever, just give them Calpol, etc. And but that's just suppressing the body's attempts to try and throw what's just been injected into their body. It's and although it's such a serious subject, but even though a lot of times I think, well, if it wasn't, it would make very good comedy the way they think. But sadly, there's so many health issues now with children, subtle ones, because they're not like back in the end of the 1800s when, say, there was some injuries, vaccine injuries. They were very, very obvious because they'd be like, say, the limb where the injection was made. Well, it was made with a lancet, making an incision and adding in the material into the arm. But there'd be all sorts of awful injuries from things like that. So they were very obvious. But now, with all the more modern methods, and there can be a lot of subtle changes. So if a baby at 2 months has their full round, which is quite a lot now, sort of multiple ones, 6 in one, and then another one there and another one there, you wouldn't know. I mean, they all have the potential to cause varying degrees of brain inflammation. So it's not just 0 or 100, it's all those different 1%, 3%, So if they, at 4 years old, get diagnosed with learning difficulties or something like autistic spectrum or, these type of things, or they've got allergies, we don't know how much of that was from those baby vaccines. We don't know. You can't ever know, because you wouldn't know how the child would have been if they hadn't had them. So this is the problem. Like, they don't do any studies long term of, and how could you ever know anyway? Because it's got to be that same child, really. What would they be like without or with? But you can't do those. So some of us tolerate so much more than others, depending on our health. Level of health makes such a huge difference to how you deal with anything in life,
So if you're talking to a new parent now, what do you say to them?
Well, obviously, if I'm approached, I first ask them how much they've read on the subject, because some are quite knowledgeable already. If they say, look, I've just heard from so and so, and I'm worried, I just start encouraging them to start from the foundations rather than say, oh, let's look at that vaccine. Oh, is that okay? Or maybe this one's okay, or whatever, which, okay, it's interesting, but are any of them appropriate? So I always I encourage them. I can't get them to encourage them to look back at the history of disease and all these different, what they give them names: measles, mumps, rubella, whooping cough, diphtheria. Have a look at the declines firstly, because most people, and I'm including most doctors actually, I've had even paediatricians say, where did you get those graphs from? I said, they're official data. I'm surprised you don't know. I thought you would know. And they don't realise that all these different, when you see the graph and it comes down like this, and then the vaccine's introduced just off before it hits the bottom of the graph. And so just to start thinking, well, hang on, how did we achieve that without any vaccines? Well, it's better health, improve your health, better living conditions and all that, clean water, sanitation. So you look in other parts of the world where they still haven't achieved that, and they've got a lot more problems with, they're always saying measles is a killer in, some parts of what they call the developing world. But it's because they're living in poverty, terrible conditions, sometimes war zones, all these things. That's when you see a rise in problems. I think that I encourage them to start from that aspect. And then, you could say things like, well, obviously when you inject into the body, even if there were germs that were going to harm us, we would breathe things in through our nose or mouth, and it goes through a different process anyway. I mean, any sort of toxic stuff out there, if you breathe in, your body is designed very, very well, beautifully designed. It's not so vulnerable that we can't step out the door without fear of whatever. And, I encourage them to look at health. I say study health as well. What is health? Some diseases are different to others, like some diseases are environmental, but the things like the acute childhood diseases, I've come to know them as actually maturation processes during childhood. So when they have a growth spurt, you've got, and physically and mentally, you've got a lot of debris in the body. You want to chuck it out. And that's when you get rashes and clear the system. And, so many people have said, oh, my child really matured even mentally after they went through a process of having measles, which wasn't suppressed, not just keep the body well hydrated and rested, and the child bounces back very quickly. And you don't need to medicate. But people.
Do you think there's any place for any vaccines? Or in your studies, have you found that actually none are actually viable for humans?
Well, personally, I wouldn't go near one ever again. You see, they're all, whatever we're talking about, whether it's, what sort of travel vaccine or these various COVID ones they keep claiming, they're all based on incorrect theories. So germ theory, Louis Pasteur, I encourage people, check him out. Because if the germ theory isn't true, which I certainly believe it not to be, then why are we trying to protect from a germ? The vaccines are, the idea behind them is you're protecting from germs, different germs. And if that's not the case, then why are we even doing it? The way you produce health and is be healthy and live in healthy settings. And if in areas of the world where they are struggling, instead of rushing there with all these vaccines, etc., medications for those little children and the people of those countries, how about getting some clean water? Get some pipes laid, bringing in clean water, sanitation, better nutrition, etc. Then you'd see the same declines there. So personally, that's my biggest thing now, actually, because over the years, when I first looked, it was just looking into some aspects, but then about probably 93, 94, I read a book, Pasteur Exposed, and it really made me think about questioning the germ theory. But it's a very big area to question because everything is based on that, and people can't let go of their there must be germs out there that are going to harm us, and it's very hard to adopt a new way of looking at things. So in recent years, particularly with the virus stories, I just put more and more of that kind of information into the newsletter that I've been producing for. This sadly is the last year, 33 years I've been producing a newsletter. And I'm trying now very much to say to people, please question these background theories, because they are the foundations for vaccines. And when you realise that there's so much assumption, what would you say, misconceptions, hypotheses that haven't been proven that we're relying on for this industry, well, the whole thing would just go, because people would think, oh, it's not that reason why I'm getting sick. It's not that reason why my child's got a rash. And there would be no demand. And then the vaccine industry, well, they would have to look for something else to sell you. But to me, that's the essence of it. Which I'd love to see more happening, even with recent years, with all the medical people and scientists speaking out generally with COVID.
Please sign up to receive our newsletter and you'll be notified of UKMFA campaigns, open letters, calls to action and any important updates. You can do this on our website at ukmedfreedom.org. That's ukmedfreedom.org.
The majority still talk about germs as if they have definitely been proven to be pathogenic, which they haven't. And there are a few doctors and scientists out there who have been trying to get this whole conversation going, but they seem to have been censored, even by what you might call the truth movement, because there's different degrees of truths within the truth movement, even.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because now we've got Robert Kennedy Jr. In place in the United States, and everyone was sort of putting a lot of faith in what he might be able to do in terms of, I know especially autism has been talking about post-vaccination and the rest of the pharmaceutical industry. Do you have any hope there at all?
Well, I have to say not really, because over the years he's done a lot of good work, and it was very interesting to see how he moved from, he originally questioned mercury within the environment, and then some parents approached him about the mercury products used in some of the vaccines, especially back then. They've slowly pulled them all out, that product. I think there's still a few trace elements of mercury in a few of the vaccines, but he started to then look at vaccines, and he has done a lot of good work. But again, he seems to have stopped when it comes to questioning germ theory and virus theory. And I don't understand why, because when you can look into such, in an investigative manner that he has done with all these things, other vaccines, why would he stop and not go further and say, hang on, what science is there for actually the whole idea of these germs and viruses? So, I don't know. He might be in that position, but so far I've been very disappointed with some of the things that have been said about the vaccines, or MMR. Of course, when they were claiming all these measles outbreaks, I think it's interesting how it's often used as a way of trying to round up people, the public, back to the vaccine sort of mindset. And it's interesting, just after he became a sort of head of the health secretary type of position out there, that suddenly they say, oh, measles. And it was almost like it was a deliberate thing to conjure up these stories. I mean, there's always cases of measles scattered around. A lot of times probably people wouldn't even bother to go to the doctors about it, and also measles predominantly is in the springtime, like some flus are very, it's predominantly in the spring, because that's a time of growth, when we change from, the winter period to the around March, same time as when they introduced COVID. It was the whole COVID story was introduced the weekend the lockdown started, was the spring equinox, and that's when you get a lot of flu-like symptoms, because we're shifting from one season into another, and our body's chucking out rubbish, ready to be in it's like the period of growth, spring into summer, and so it is a time where you might get a peak for things. But I'd love to be proved wrong, but I'm not so reliant on what he might achieve and how far he is able to go anyway, whatever he truly believes. I don't know. But
No, well, I think on a personal basis, I would agree with you. I don't see very much happening right now, and I think once they get into those positions, I think they're then advised they can't go down the road they initially started down.
I think so.
And I think it's very much the same here in the UK. And I don't know if you can see any hope with anyone in government or in any of the opposition parties, but again, I'm not really seeing very much.
Well, you know what? It's so similar. I mean, I delved into the history a lot, and funnily enough, it's some stuff just like history repeating itself. But when they first implemented a Vaccine Act in 1853 for the smallpox vaccine to become mandatory for all babies, in the first 3 months they had to receive this vaccine. There was no kind of opposition in Parliament at all, and why particularly, which is the same now. These people, MPs, they don't know where to turn, and so who do they turn to? Like the health department for advice. So back in the 1850s, it was the Epidemiological Society, and they were the vaccinators. So they're pushing for the vaccines. The MPs are like, well, we don't know, we better go to the experts. We go to the people who are trying to push things. So the majority of MPs, sadly, they're just as ignorant as a lot of the medical world now on this subject. So it's like a circle of, we're pushing it, you accept it, or what do we do? We'll ask the people who are pushing it. So, no, I haven't seen any political party sort of taking a stand. Interesting, back in the 90s, I was invited with a colleague to a Green Party annual conference, and we did present on the subject, and they were very like, oh yes, we should always preserve an informed choice, etc. Now, during the COVID period, I know people who were in the Green Party who got banned from the Green Party Facebook whatever groups because they dared to say, oh, should we look into this COVID vaccine? What's going on? And they got banned as anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theorists type of thing. So even parties like Green Party, which you might think were a little bit less, dictatorial and draconian or whatever in their thinking. But no, so no parties are reliable. The only party is reliable is yourself. You have to look into it. I think if everybody looked into it, including a lot of medical people, they would stop and there'd be no demand then, and they would realise the whole storyline is based on unproven hypothesis, and there's never been any of these truly so-called gold standard trials on vaccines where how would you do one now? How would you even find a group of completely unvaccinated population completely? Because even if you took some children, they've already had numerous ones as babies. So, how would you ever get those kind of groups available? So,
you can find the UK Medical Freedom Alliance in most social media locations, in particular Facebook, on X, YouTube, Spotify, and of course Apple Podcasts, and our favoured location of all, Rumble, which is the home of free speech. You'll also find us in the mainstream media and of course the alternative media too. Remember to like, subscribe and follow at every opportunity, and you'll be notified when our next broadcast is becoming available.
No, I think you have to become your own, in a way, your own doctor even, I might say. Obviously we need A&E if we're injured. We hope that they'll patch us up well. We hope they're in a good mood, the surgeon, that day, and do a good job. But otherwise, a lot of things, there's so much common sense stuff you can do. And luckily, there are even quite a few interesting doctors and natural health practitioners who are available on these websites, where you can learn quite a lot about what you can do with simple things, even things in the kitchen cupboard. But a lot of it is just simply resting the body, keeping hydrated, and being in a tender, loving environment. And most things you'll get through very simply, if it's managed, because
it's just a shame that the independent doctors are, they have to be on the commercial side. They have to charge for their services because they've got to survive in this commercial world.
Yeah.
And we can't go to National Insurance and say, can I have a lump of my money back, please, because I need to go and pay this doctor. They won't do that. They still insist you've got to see someone in the NHS, where the narrative is too strong to battle against. And that's quite sad.
It is sad from that angle, but some doctors are presenting with courses you can do to learn to do things for yourself. So you don't have to turn to always a practitioner. I mean, over the years, I've done certain things for myself or my children, and just following naturopathic methods and fine, everything beautifully. I've nursed a severe case of tonsillitis, and even well-meaning homeopaths and other practitioners said, "Oh, give them this remedy and that." I said, "Well, actually, I don't need to, because they're getting very well. I can see a recovery happening. I don't really need to use anything." So I did. I was using just literally bed rest, ventilated room. It was very water initially. Once the fever had passed, then just giving them a very light diet of grapefruit, actually. This is tonsillitis. And I watched the tonsils from being very infected, and they're not very pleasant when they're all full of, this sort of pus-like stuff over the tonsils, and ghastly sort of aroma coming from their breath. And then suddenly it breaks, and the breath becomes sweet again, and you watch the tonsils go down, and they cleared all the rubbish out and never had any repeat performance of it. Other people say, well, my child had tonsillitis, they had antibiotics, and then it came back again, reoccurring tonsillitis over and over, more antibiotics, and then later they said, oh, they've got glandular fever or whatever, because they kept suppressing the body's attempt to get rid of the stuff. So, when you do things like that for yourself, you learn so much. Obviously, you wouldn't put your child in danger if you could see deterioration. You would go and seek advice. But I've never experienced that. It's always gone in towards a good, healthy outcome. So it's having the confidence, because we've all been put in a state of fear. Oh, you mustn't do that. You must get fever down. You must get. So people are scared of disease, but I think
the doctors are as well, though, because that's the thing the doctors will keep telling you, to get the fever down, and then that, so it's been so indoctrinated into them, that they repeat it out themselves.
Yes.
Okay, so what now for the informed parent? So I think you said you got 2 more issues to go this year.
Yes.
And then that will be
That's the end of
the
the
last one
new.
will be
At the moment, that because we had a
yeah,
paper edition for many, many years, and of course, with all the costs and postage and all this, and also the
yeah,
younger parents generally are not so interested in physical newsletters, which is a shame,
right,
I have to say, because with paper materials you can always refer back to them, and you're more likely to read them even than having an email, and you might just think, oh, I'll read it another day, and you never even open it. But so it just wasn't, economically I couldn't keep it going. And so I thought, well, if I put my energies now into re-looking at the website, I've started an archive library, which I've got literature from the 1800s even, so people can go back and really look into the background stories. So I've got plenty more to add to that, and I want to, yes, have focus on that. So I want to still be out there. I'm happy to do interviews and talk about the subject. I do give some talks on, so I do a more or less 2 hour lecture on the history of vaccination, where I walk through the 1800s, what went on then, which is so different to what we have been led to believe. Edward Jenner has been glorified, as Louis Pasteur has been glorified. All these people, when you actually start reading up, you think, well, this isn't correct, and there's been so many, even out back then, lots of interesting doctors and scientists speaking out when they started to see the results of so many years of smallpox vaccine, and the deaths and injuries from the vaccine were far, great, very great. So I will keep a presence. If there's, I might even consider. I'm looking at possibly doing an occasional Substack type of article, maybe a podcast thing. It's I'm just having a little bit of a step back to see what's the best way, especially, like I say, the younger generations are used to videos and TikTok and short things. Our newsletter generally was used to be up to 28 sides, and I used to get articles from across the world, so medical journals, holistic practitioners, different people's experiences, all kinds of articles, which just to try and bring in a varied amount to say this is interesting, and even what would be considered pro-vaccination articles, I would put them in and break them down and say, well, hang on, what's this first paragraph saying? And actually analyse what they're saying, because a lot of times when you start breaking it down, it falls apart, or, and encourage people to, if they get told something by a health professional, say, fine, that's interesting. Can you provide me with literature so that I can study it? And they usually can't. And so
So the best places to find you then are, so you have a website
yeah,
which you can, if you fire the details over to me, obviously I'll put the links in our
yeah,
description.
yeah.
You have a Substack as well
I
already?
haven't. I've just set one up, but I've not used it yet. So I'm sort of thinking. I've got a Rumble
Okay.
channel as well, where I actually uploaded many videos. I had them converted because in the 90s it was all like videos, and so I had them converted
Yeah.
to digital. And there's lots of interesting talks by different doctors back in those days. There are even clips and audio of radio programs where I might have had a few minutes on there, different discussions, and I'd like to add more to that. So there's the Rumble channel, and we'll put the links, like you say, I'll pass them on to you so people can click on them. But the informedparent.co.uk is my website, and also I'd love it if you could put a few other websites which I would recommend, because, like I say, there's some
Absolutely.
very good doctors out there, and I
Yeah.
would recommend you
Yeah.
approach them as well to get them on, even though they may not be based in the UK. Some excellent doctors out there that are really pulling apart the whole, you know, the whole storyline about all these different aspects, and they were medical doctors. It's much harder for medical doctors to let go of all their education. It's easier for a lay person because we haven't been, like you say. We're not so
obviously we know a good few medical doctors that are fighting the GMC right now.
Yes.
That's the problem, is that they come out and talk about things and then find themselves being hauled over the coals. But we love them, we support them, and absolutely, any details you can give us, we'll put onto our onto the description, and that will be circulated.
Thank you, yeah.
It's
well, those doctors, GMC, why bother with them? Resign, set your own health practice up, and why be part of a system that's been captured, hijacked by the pharmaceutical industry? It's about time that all these people awake in the medical world, just break away from that system, because that system is not about health. It's about pharmaceutical products, vaccines, drugs, pushing them onto the public, and they all have side effects. They often lead to other drugs being given, which also spiral into all sorts of health issues. And people, it's not a health service. It's an ill health service now, and there's lots of good people within the medical world that would be better off saying, no thanks, I'm going to set something different up. We need a proper health system now. That's my view, anyway.
No, absolutely. Well, look, it's been we've done our hour at least, but virtually. So I think I'm going to close this down now, because it's been fascinating. I've got a lot to process now, it's been very, very interesting.
Good.
Real pleasure to meet you. Thanks so much for coming on. And wish you just every success with everything you're doing. And anytime you ever want to come back on here, you're very, very welcome. Just drop me a line and we'll speak again.
Thank you very, very much, Ian. Thank you.